Shouldn't be afraid of bees. Shouldn't be afraid of those creepy crawlies. You should be afraid of me. Shouldn't be scared of the Dracula. Shouldn't be scared of the mummy. Shouldn't be scared of Frankenstein's monster. You should be scared of me. You should be scared of me. The boogeyman under your bed.
Hello, and welcome to What a Scream, the podcast where I, your host, Golly Miss Dolly, chats to a special guest about horror movies, and in particular horror movies that have to do with a certain theme or subject that I have previously randomly chosen. So this week, the theme that I pulled out of my cup of horror was British folk horror. Now, I am not a fan of British folk horror at all. I'm quite outspoken in my lack of love for it. There are only two kind of British folk horror films that I actually quite enjoy, and they're quite modern ones. One is The Borderlands from 2013 that I've previously discussed with my friend Paul Walsh on the episode about Christianity versus paganism. And the other film that I actually quite enjoy is the film that I will be discussing today. So before I get into the discussion and introduce our guest, I'm going to give you a little bit of history behind British folk horror in the movies. So the term folk horror was thought to have been coined by director Peter Sadsy, retrospectively talking about his film, The Blood on Satan's Claw from 1971, although the term was again popularised by Mark Gatiss in his 2010 documentary, A History of Horror. Folk horror tends to use elements of folklore to create the fear of the unknown and the uncanny. Elements of folk horror can include themes of isolation, religion, the dark power of nature, and the bleakness and underlying darkness of rural landscapes. The horror is created from the actions and beliefs of people rather than any supernatural elements, with a focus on outsiders invading private and tight-knit rural communities. The genre was thought to have been heavily influenced by the counterculture and New Age movements of the 1960s, as well as the newfound obsession with occultism and pagan rituals of the time. When it comes to British folk horror, we find three films that have been dubbed the Unholy Trinity, which consists of 1968's Witchfinder General, directed by Michael Reeves, the aforementioned Blood on Satan's Claw from 1971, directed by Peter Sadsy, and of course, Robin Hardy's 1973 cult classic, The Wicker Man, which myself and Paul Walsh previously discussed in the Christianity versus Paganism episode. So go check that out if you haven't already. We do a very, very in-depth discussion on The Wicker Man. So this week, myself and my special guest will be discussing two films that fall under the British folk horror header, one from the 70s and one from about 10 years ago in 2011. And they are 1972's ecological folk horror Doomwatch, directed by Peter Sadsy, and Ben Wheatley's Kill List. Now, my guest this week on What a Scream is Lydia Addams, performer, model, DJ, and owner of Dublin's best goth club night, Necropolis. So join us as we talk all things British folk horror. So I would like to welcome to the podcast Lydia Addams. How are you?
Hello, I'm well, thank you. Hiding indoors from the cold. It is kind of a bit Baltic this week.
Just a little bit. It was a bit snowy.
A little bit, though not as much as I anticipated.
They keep saying beast from the east, and it's like, more like,
expecting it to be a repeat of 2018 again, with essentially, the national lockdown of you can't go out. There's a snow curfew. And really it's just been a bit of a sprinkling. I invested in snow boots just to walk my dog for the whole thing of any ice or that kind of thing. Like I mainly wear Converse or like cute little like ankle boots and stuff. So they obviously have no grip whatsoever.
Yeah.
But yeah, at least I have some decent waterproof boots now.
Yeah. So. And if we ever do get our blizzard again.
There'll always be another one. There will always be another one.
They keep saying like, the beast from the east and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, it's more like just, your scary aunt from the west.
It's just a bit of a cold front. We're all used to it from our families. We know the drill. We know the drill. Just stay indoors. You'll be fine.
Yes. So for anyone that doesn't know you, do you want to give us a little info about yourself and what you do?
Yeah, sure. I suppose I am your stereotypical spooky kid goth next door. I would probably be a bit better known for working at some of the burlesque shows in Dublin. So typically I do stage management or front of house, and I would be known as Beastie, tends to be the call. So Beastie, Bella Agogo's stage Beastie. I occasionally perform, though it's very, very rare.
Yes.
And I also happen to run a goth alternative like club night with spooky themes in it called Necropolis Dublin. So I suppose really the idea with that is that there's live performers, there's DJs, and also then there's live performances and music as well. And then just general creepy vibes, creepy visuals, some creepy music. Just, you know, an all around wholesome, spooky occasion for everybody.
I had a great old time performing it was your Halloween Necropolis.
Yes, it was the first inaugural, like, proper effort at the big idea, because there've been a few kind of like quieter DJ nights in the run up to it, and this was like the proper full-on execution. And then of course lockdown comes, so we couldn't go ahead with the Valentine's anti-Valentine's horror one or the Halloween one last year, but there's been a bunch of online DJ sets this year anyway, just to kind of keep me sane, and obviously hoping to be back with a bang whenever it's safe to do so.
Hopefully. Praying. So obviously this is a podcast about horror, so I'd like to back to horror.
Back to the horror.
The thing that's been keeping us sane during all of this. So what is your relationship like with horror? Are you a horror fan?
Yes and no.
Okay.
So I know that's a bit of a weird one to say, especially it's not your typical kind of goth answer either. I'm very much a Hammerhouse of horror fan. I love all the old horror movies, like even the black and white German expressionist ones with just the amazing like hand painted sets and stuff. That is totally my bag, and I absolutely adore them. Like Vincent Price, Peter Cushing, Christopher Lee. Oh yeah, totally. Boris Karloff. Yay! You always know you're going to be in for a good movie, and like even just Lon Chaney been just amazing. I haven't really tried so much with more modern, and when I say modern, I'm also going to just check myself on the fact that I'm saying from like the 80s onwards, so it's not really all that modern and technically counts as vintage these days anyway. And things like even say Saw or that kind of thing just never appeal to me. I have a bit of an overactive imagination as it is anyway. So the thought of like paranormal activity or that kind of thing absolutely scares the bejesus out of me, because I don't know, poltergeists just terrify me. Same with aliens, but we're working on it. And like I'm more actively working on it, I suppose. One of the joys of lockdown, during October I was trying to do the Spooktober challenge of essentially 31 horror movies over the course of the month, so one for every day of the month. So myself and my partner were, because he's over in the UK, we're remotely watching them together and comparing notes. So I've caught up on all really the essentials like Halloween, Nightmare on Elm Street, like all of those fun things that I should have seen so long ago, and that I was somewhat slightly too freaked out to watch. And it turns out it was absolutely fine, and nothing has scarred me for life yet. I'm still managing to sleep perfectly fine. So
I'm guessing that a lot of the guests I've had on the show have said they got into horror because, you know, their older siblings got them into it, or they sneaked down and their parents were watching it. I'm guessing that because you have a certain era of horror that you're into, that you didn't have that same experience.
Not at all. I have one sibling who's 14 years older than me, so and his version of babysitting was to literally sit on me. So it's effective, I'll give him that. But yeah, I suppose my introduction was more through just having a really crappy sleep pattern. I'm more of a night owl, though now a perpetually just tired raccoon. And I suppose during like secondary school, it used to be my thing that during the summer holidays, you know, you'd have the 3 free months and my sleep pattern would just go to shite, really. So I'd spend a lot of time just downstairs watching late night TV, and Channel 4 was amazing for so many old movie reruns, and that's how I got introduced to Hammerhouse of Horror and their incredibly expansive budget for paint, just red paint, because it's clearly not clearly not fake blood that they're using, it's just red paint. But so that's just kind of how I stumbled into it, really.
And did your love of the Gothic subculture come from that, or were you more interested in it because of your interest in the Gothic music and subculture?
That is a really good question, and I feel like the movies probably came first before before I got fully introduced to the amazing place that is Camden, because that's how I kind of fell into goth. And just wall-to-wall goth stores, and just the amazement of, oh my god, you can essentially just play dress up all the time. Like
that's how I fell into punk. I was more of starting off, I was a punk. My dad was a punk. And then when I got old enough to go to London by myself, it was Camden that introduced me to the subcultures.
And then getting like a lot of the UK magazines as well. So getting like Bizarre or Alternative, and just seeing that these amazing things, you can actually live your life like this. Oh my god. So exciting. So yeah, I suppose they were very close in terms of time, but I think the movies maybe came a little bit beforehand.
Okay. That's great. I said I was a punk, but I kind of drifted through the subcultures as a teenager, because again, you're quite impressionable. But my dad did have quite a strong influence over me, because he was, you know, the original punk, and then after punk became post-punk and goth, like The Cure and Susie and the Banshees. So I went through my Cure phase of goth, and I kind of, like yourself, I became obsessed with 1930s kind of style horror.
Yep.
From the gothic subculture. I was obsessed with that. I was very imaginative child as it was. I've always been into like witches and demons and serial killers, but I really got into the 1930s Universal through the gothic subculture. Yeah,
totally. Like, I mean, there's such iconic images even created by Bela Lugosi as Dracula. You've got Mila Nurmi as well as Vampira.
Of course,
Then of course you see like later developments as Cassandra Peterson becomes Elvira. And of course the whole nod from The Simpsons as well, that like there's so many things that worked into popular culture, but like Boo Barella, The Simpsons. And just so many well-known images that definitely are going through a revival again, which is fantastic. And it's this kind of wonderful familiar nostalgia, and I find that there's a lot of comfort in that.
Yeah, definitely. Now, you say that you got heavily into Hammer horror.
Yes.
And our theme this week, it kind of started off the back of Hammer horror. And it kind of started as Hammer horror was kind of slowing down a bit.
Yeah.
So our theme this week is British folk horror. What is your experience with British folk horror, and are you a fan?
It has been somewhat limited, I suppose, for me. Like the obvious one that comes to mind is obviously going to be The Wicker Man. And even if you haven't seen it, you're familiar with the general kind of setup, and like even, I suppose, its impact in popular culture. Like, what was it? The League of Gentlemen or something was the sitcom show with the whole, you know, you're not local, you're not from around here. We didn't burn him. So it definitely, it has trickled down like that. And also even just watching the movie, it's kind of wildly entertaining to just see Christopher Lee running around in Converse.
I actually, the last episode I just recorded, one of the films we talked about was The Wicker Man.
Yeah.
It was about Christianity versus paganism. And one of the things, apart from like obviously the musical numbers and the naked gyrating against walls, one of the big things that stuck out at me was Christopher Lee's Converse.
Yeah, it's just so strange and so unexpected. So I'm so glad that someone else noticed. Thank you for that. But so oh, sorry, that was a very squeaky but so I suppose for me, folk horror, even if you're getting as specific as British folk horror, is very much, it's very insular, and it's the fear of the outsider. And I think the two choices as well for today have been really interesting. One is actually almost the exact opposite. So I don't know if I should give too much away at this point, and I can elaborate a little bit later, but it's just intriguing how it almost works in a reverse sense. And then one is your classic format of that. And I suppose, like, my parents are from Roscommon, so I'm well used to a country attitude on things, and not exactly being local, but blowing in every so often, and thankfully never experiencing those kind of hostilities, but just the feeling of this is all quite different to what I'm used to, and the unusual challenge of trying to integrate and understand at the same time.
Yeah, I suppose the thing I have with folk horror, and especially, you know, we see this very different contrast of American folk horror, which is a lot of, like, as they call Hicksploitation.
Deliverance.
Chainsaw, Deliverance. With British folk horror, I think the problem I have with it is because, like, I'm not a fan. I'm quite outwardly spoken about not being a fan of British folk horror, apart from the 2 films that I discussed last week and this week I'm a fan of. The problem I have with it is I have lived those experiences, apart from obviously being sacrificed.
Yes. So if you've done a very good job coming back from it. So well done.
Resurrection at its finest. No, but I was the one who moved from, suburban kind of outer skirts of London and moved to the arse end of nowhere in County Mayo, and being that outsider and having people look at me in a weird way, and because I dressed a different way, I was called a Satanist and all this kind of stuff, which, it might be true, but when you're a child and that's kind of, you're being looked at with kind of strange eyes, and it feels very isolating. And then when you're surrounded by a countryside that is physically isolating, I think that's my problem with British folk horror, is that I've lived that experience and it just doesn't rub well with me somehow.
Okay. For you, does it, I suppose, make it a little bit more difficult or irksome to watch, or does it kind of add to the degree of discomfort experienced when watching it, so it almost perhaps intensifies the effect?
I think it's more irksome.
Okay.
I think because a lot of times in British folk horror, we have outsiders that are Christian coming into a pagan community, whereas for me, it was the other way around. I was coming into a very Christian community, from more of a atheistic or paganistic view. And it was very, I look at it and I think it's not believable for me. I feel that for a horror to be effective, it has to have some sort of kind of believability about it.
Yeah.
And for me, British folk horror doesn't, because it's very Christian versus pagan. And again, I discussed this all in last week's episode, but I think that's the problem I have with it.
Okay. Oh, that's fairly fair. I suppose for me, I don't know, like I just haven't watched too many of them, so I don't really have strong feelings. Like I get that there's the Wicker Man and I get that there's the trickle down. But yeah, aside from, I'm not even sure I can name that many other British folk horrors. So like maybe The Witch Hunter General kind of sort of counts as one, because it's also very much an English experience of not only the Civil War that happened, but also then like the witch trials in it, and it is set quite rurally. So I suppose there's a bit of a stretch that can be made for that, but like, yeah, it's an odd one, and I don't think it's necessarily as scarily, ominously violent as perhaps the American ones are quite presented as. Yeah,
definitely. So I suppose we should get into the 2 films that we've actually chosen. So we're going to start off with the film that you've chosen. Do you want to introduce it to us and give us a brief synopsis?
Yeah, sure. So I, in my naivety and lack of knowledge on the genre, did a bit of an Google and came up with a movie called Doomwatch that was made in 1972 by Peter Sadsy. Now it's recommended on the BFI's website as like one of the top 10 underrated folk horrors. So I kind of figured, Jesus, we're in for something with that. So it turns out that actually it was based on a TV show that the BBC had made of the same name, which ran from 1970 to 1972. So I suppose for the conversation of its pertinence on the topic, the TV show was sort of hailed as sci-fi, though the creators said that it was all very well researched and actually based on like proper real issues. So they didn't find that it was fantasy based, if you get me, but very much a science TV show. So arguably the movie being very much in the same vein and a continuation of that, the setting for the movie is very much folk horror, but it is also with a bit of a sciencey focus. So Doomwatch in itself, they're a government department that does scientific measurement of essentially how doomed we are from an environmental perspective. It's a rather charming name.
Yeah.
Their official thing is that they're the Department of Measurement of Scientific Work. So they investigate any research by the government or the private sector which presents a danger to humanity. They focus on environmental issues and dangers through technology and its misuse. And apparently, like, it was really significant and really got the attention of the British public at the time. So it had like up to 13 million viewers in its heyday for the 2 years that it ran. Then the film followed not too long after, in 1972. And I suppose for me, one of the interesting things about it, given the environmental focus, is that a lot of the issues that they looked at the time are actually still very relevant. And I quite liked that. While the movie in itself was not scary from a like jump scare perspective or particularly gory or anything else, I liked the concern about, oh, this could potentially happen. We could all be doomed because of this. And even just sitting at home locked down in a pandemic, at one point there's just like a similar mentality of, oh man, this kind of relates to COVID as well, doesn't it? But yeah, so in your typical setup for folk horror, it is the outsider who has to go into a very isolated community. So in this instance, it's a scientist who's sent from Doomwatch to essentially take like sea life samples back from an island called Balf, that they've picked up on a contaminant in the ocean waters, and they want to kind of measure it and see what's the extent of it. And once he gets to Balf, it seems like it's going to be a standard thing. He expects that he's only going to be there one night, if even. And yeah, the entire community are incredibly hostile towards him. He struggles to find somewhere to stay. He goes to various members of the community, like a local innkeeper, the local policeman, the local priest. None of them are taking him in. So he finally finds somewhere. And through there, he actually finds there's another guest staying who has been there actually long term, and she is a local school teacher who has also come to the island as an outsider and has found it incredibly difficult to integrate. So they then become bosom buddies throughout the entire thing, and she helps him communicate with the town and kind of start to win their trust. But initially they're very suspicious. There is something going on, and he has been watched while he's conducting his business, and he thinks it's just, routine, picking up the samples and everything else. But it transpires that the hostility of the community is actually hiding, essentially there's something going wrong with the people living on the island, and they are hiding the people who are impacted. So hence they're incredibly hostile about taking outsiders into their home, having them in their community. So what's happening, it's actually a real condition as well, which is, I suppose, hats off to the researchers and everything. Now, granted,
they were very thorough with their research.
Totally. And even before this, I had to just do a double check on how to pronounce it. So the inhabitants of the island are getting stricken down with acromegalia. So it's essentially because there's contaminants in the water. It turns out that the Navy, conveniently, have been dumping radioactive waste. And very inconveniently, beside it, a private company essentially put out to tender for a very lackluster disposal company to handle a pituitary hormone that they had been working on, which proved to be too volatile. So there's like vats and vats and vats of this stuff that they just took on the lowest bidder in terms of a disposal company, who just go start lobbing it into the sea. And of course, they dump it beside the radioactive waste. So what should have been nullified by the water and not really supposedly that much of a problem then becomes an issue. And there's larger fish, there's more aggressive wildlife, like even dogs on the island are being impacted by it. So in terms of the people, the inhabitants living on the island, the acromegalia, so it manifests in extended bone growth in the forehead, the nose, the jaw, their hands and their feet as well. They almost turn very gargoyle-like in that they're starting to lose movement. They're getting these hardened visages, really, and just kind of overgrown, while also becoming very irrational and very violent. So a lot of the families are trying to hide them away and are so caught up in the shame complex that's associated with it. So part of the issue being that because they're an island population, they've come to believe that it's a divine curse for them being an inbred population based on the island. So there's a lot of stigma and there's a lot of shame to do with that.
Yeah, and there's the vicar that really lays it on thick. And
exactly. So that's obviously not helping. And then for an outsider to come from the mainland, they're not receptive to this at all, because understandably they're so caught up in this shame complex. And the fear of not only judgment on them, but also the people that they care about, who they're trying to protect, but also potentially what is presented by the mainland and its interference and how it may destruct and like dissolve their way of life as they know it entirely. So when the scientist is able to engage with the community and explain what's going on, and that it's actually a treatable condition, that it will take time, like potentially months, potentially years in the worst cases, but it is something that can be handled, he's still met with a lot of resistance. And the school teacher that he befriends is very instrumental in helping to get a town hall together to get the inhabitants to come listen to him, to understand what's going on, because he's waiting on assistance from the mainland to come help them. And this is kind of like his last ditch attempt to try and win them over. It doesn't go so well with them, and then essentially an angry mob follows him back to where he goes to try and use the telephone to call back to the mainland. And at this point I was thinking, oh, this is going to, this is going to go in the way of the Wicker Man. Definitely, this guy's going to be lobbed into, like a burning pit or something. Just something terrible is going to happen. And it doesn't. No. As a horror movie, very few people die. Very little horrific anything happens. Like aside from he gets attacked by a dog and then one of the people suffering from acromegalia, that's the extent of really the horror and the jump scares of it. I think it's more reliant on the fear that's presented by the environmental issue, but then also like that one reveal of one of the really bad cases of one of the sufferers of acromegalia, and then that that's going to be so terrifying and so horrific for you. But I suppose for anyone who hasn't seen the movie, there's someone who presents to him at one point who has a lesser case of it, and like he's referring to it as going ugly, so that's what their local term for it is. It's very similar to the vampire makeup in Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So it's that intense brow that kind of goes down into the nose, and I don't know, maybe they perhaps kind of cross research on that one, but it's something very akin to that, but then obviously with a stronger jawline. And just as horror movies go, it ends rather well.
Yes, it's quite uplifting. I mean, a trait of perhaps British folk horror is that it's very bleak.
Yes,
and I was incredibly bleak.
Very caught off guard by this, that it's all wrapped up kind of nicely, that people are saddened that they're leaving their way of life, and like families are being taken away from the island and going off to the mainland to go get treatment. But that, and like I suppose the anecdotal conversation then that the way of life on the island is destroyed, but that people will be back and that it will return, and it's a note on that resilience. But that's essentially the wild ride that is the movie. Scientist comes, people are resistant, something strange is happening, he finds out what it is, has a town hall, persuades them to go get help, and bingo bango bongo.
I mean, it is, we can see it as a folk horror film, because obviously it has the isolated rural community who are suspicious of outsiders. They shun modern technology, which was modern at the time of the 70s. And this rural community have secrets to hide. This film, it predated The Wicker Man, obviously, but it almost anticipates The Wicker Man. We see a lot of similarities, like missing girls.
It's the well-intentioned outsider who comes for an official purpose, and it's not like they're sticking their nose in to be a busybody, or just that they're on holiday or getting in the way for whatever reason. Like for the Wicker Man, it's the policeman to investigate the girl. For this, it's a scientist who's just looking for like seawater and sea life samples.
And then we've got as well, there's a running theme of, I don't know if you noticed this, but food. So in The Wicker Man, he goes and he has this pub lunch and he's like, this food is disgusting. I thought you islanders were known for your food. And he's very patronizing, condescending. In this, again, he has some pub grub, whatever you want to call it. And he's like, the fish is awful. What's going on? Whereas he sees it as a warning about what's going on. Whereas, Constable Edward Woodward, I love that actor's name. I know that's not his character's name, but I just love the actor's name. I'm just going to call him Edward Woodward.
Sure.
He doesn't see that as a warning.
Exactly. And even the fisherman that brings him out in the boat so that they
Mhm.
can get the samples, when they get one particular type of fish, he can't recognize what type of fish it is, but the fisherman's like, oh, but it's such and such. It's like a
Yeah.
turbot or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's far greater than what it should be normally.
Yeah.
And it's really beefed up because of the contaminants in
Yeah.
the water. So this is again another warning sign of what's yet to come. And
Yeah.
this is how the people are getting impacted because they obviously have an ocean-based diet.
Yeah, exactly. And we see a lot of other similarities with the Wicker Man, but obviously the Wicker Man is a lot more bleak. A lot more bleak.
Yes.
They
do have rather charming costumes in a little, street parade.
Yeah. Very charming.
Yeah,
but we can say that there was a certain sacrifice for the islanders in Doomwatch, because they had to sacrifice their community and their beliefs, whereas in Wicker Man there is an actual human sacrifice.
Yes. And very much that they even the sacrifice of families who have hidden away people in their families without knowing how to handle or help or cure them, and in some instances where they've gotten really, really bad and they've lost all reason, they've gotten really violent.
Yeah.
They're easy to anger. Essentially, they're just putting them away in barns and just trying to keep them safe and out of the way and trying to protect them as much as they can. But obviously, they're sacrificing those family relationships and those connections.
Yeah. I mean, the horror is very much kind of confined within the island. It's
very much so.
It's not a horror for the outsider. It's actually the outsider that comes and is the hero and saves the islanders.
Yes.
Whereas the horror in more traditional British folk horror is pretty much the horror is on the outsiders.
Yep.
Yeah.
Definitely they fall prey to it.
Exactly. I was kind of surprised by Doomwatch. When you mentioned it. When you mentioned it, I was kind of like, I've never heard of this before. And then obviously watching it and I read up a bit on it. Like you said, it's not jump out of your skin horror, but if you look at it from the rural communities kind of point of view, it is quite horrific. And then if you look at it from an environmental point of view, we can see how this very day, how environmental factors can actually create horrific situations.
Very much so. And especially given that just environmental issues are becoming that much more recognized for the impact that they're having. So I thought that just from that particular perspective, this kind of made it a bit more of a pertinent pick. And actually, to be honest, I'm a little bit intrigued to go check out the TV show as well. Because one of the notes that I was reading said about how the first episode, it's essentially a laboratory-made virus to eat plastic. Now, it says it escapes. I don't know how a virus escapes, but somehow the virus gets out and runs riot and somehow takes down a plane. And so they go from there. So I'm kind of thinking, you know what, like we've been looking at things like bacteria and all kinds of other things that eat plastic. So that's kind of interesting and a wonderful, still kind of on the nose. So I'm intrigued. I want to check it out a little bit more.
Yeah, I definitely want to know what it's like. I'm all up for a 70s BBC TV drama that borderline sci-fi.
And early staff from Doctor Who had been involved in Doomwatch as well. So I suppose they had the big names on it.
Yeah, must be good if they went on to do Doctor Who.
Oh god, yeah.
So the next film that I decided is we fast forward about 40 years.
Yes.
And we come to a more modern British folk horror. So this is a film called Kill List. It's from 2011 and it's directed by Ben Wheatley, who seems to have asserted himself as a bit of a British folk horror director. He directed stuff such as A Field in England and Sightseers, which is, again, if you kind of read about them, or you kind of read a blurb, they're not in your face folk horror, but when you take into such themes such as, isolation, it is intrinsically folk horror. So Kill List, it is about a British soldier who returns home from Kiev, and he joins an old friend in working as a contract killer. during a dinner party that Jay, who is the main character, his friend Gal, who is from Northern Ireland, you know, he's also been through Afghanistan, he's been through the troubles from the north. He tries to kind of persuade Jay to take this contract. And while they're chatting, Gal's girlfriend, who is quite a new girlfriend, she goes up to the bathroom, she carves a symbol in the back of the mirror, and she takes a bloody tissue from the bathroom. So from the very get-go, it's all a bit sus. We know something weird's going on, especially, I mean, the opening credit of the film is that symbol. It gets carved into the screen. So we know that shit's going to get fucked. And we basically know from the get-go it's going to have a folk horror element to it. So then they go meet the employer who wants to take out this contract, and the employer cuts Jay's hand and his own hand and forms a blood contract. And he tells them there are 3 contracts. There is the priest. They go to kill the priest, and the priest says, "Thank you very much," which is a very strange thing to be saying when you're about to get killed.
Yeah, that was really unexpected. The gratitude and been murdered just caught me off guard.
Yeah. And then their second one is the librarian. And while they are killing him, they find really disturbing videos that Gal tells Jay not to watch, but he watches them anyway. And then we have the most violent scene of the film. Jay takes a hammer to the librarian, and it does not cut away. It does not hold back. It is very in-your-face violent.
Yep. So very stark contrast as well to Doomwatch. We went from an incredibly unviolent to really, there's no panning away shots. There's nothing left to the imagination. You see everything. Yeah,
and it's quite a sharp turn. It's almost like that's where things take a turn for the worse. It's like the middle point of this film. Before then, yes, we've seen signs of aggression because Jay doesn't have a great relationship at home with his wife. They are quite aggressive towards each other.
The tension was so painful.
Yes. And obviously he's got an aggressive job. He's a soldier. He's a contract killer. But this scene is just horrific.
Yep.
Absolutely horrific. And Gal then finds folders of files on Gal and Jay, and they decide, you know what, we're going to bow out. This job's not for us. But the employer threatens their families if they don't carry out the contract. So Jay's family goes off to a family cottage to hide, and they find out their final mark is a politician. So he's quite wealthy. They're surveying his house, and they see a ceremony, and it all looks a bit Wicker Man-ish.
Yeah.
And so they kill the MP and a few of these other cultists, and they decide to get the fuck out of there, but they're chased and they go to an underground tunnel. Gal gets disemboweled. Again, another horrific scene that does not hold back on the gore.
Oh god, no.
It's not something, I mean, when you think of, say, this film from the outgo, you think it's going to be a crime film because it's all about contract killers. Contract killers are bam, shoot you in the head, leave. Like,
yeah. I was very surprised to see I was very surprised by the pick, because even just in the build to it, the folk takes a while to kick in.
Yes. And it's almost like you forget about it. You forget about that whole opening credit. You forget about the girlfriend in the bathroom because you're so concentrated on the fact that these contract killers are getting in too deep. And your mind kind of goes crime film. And you forget all about the folk. And then it hits you in the stomach.
Oh, gotcha.
So Jay manages to get away after he has to mercy kill Gal. And he escapes to the cottage where his wife and son are hiding out, but they are attacked. Jay goes outside, gets knocked unconscious, and his wife tries to fight off the attackers. And then we are transported to a field where Jay wakes up, and the cultists have stripped him and they put a mask on him, which again harkens back to
very
Wicker folk horror, very Wicker Man. And he is forced to fight his actual final mark, which is the Hunchback. Now, we don't see the Hunchback's face. We just see, again, it's masked. So it's a fight to the death. And spoiler incoming, it is revealed that it is his wife with his child on her back. And that's
totally just so caught me off guard. I did not even know what to make of that.
Me neither. I was like, I'm kind of enjoying this film, blah, blah. And then punch in the face and you're like, oh my God. And then it cuts and you're like, what
the hell was that?
You're like,
what did I just watch? What did I miss? I've been watching this really closely. What the fuck just happened?
Yeah. It's just, I just think it's just, again, it's one of the only few British folk horror films that I love because of that punch in the face out of nowhere. I did not fucking see that coming.
Yeah, I really didn't see it coming. For me personally, that more frustrates me because I'm like, what? Why was she fighting people off at the cottage then? Why was she bothering with that?
Yeah, because she's kind of laughing at the end, and it kind of mirrors, the way the priest and the librarian were like, "Thank you for killing me."
Yeah,
she's laughing, and it's like, was she involved or?
It really does seem to indicate that she's on their side and that she's kind of aware of all of it, and but I don't understand how or why or what makes her complicit in it. Like, I know that the new girlfriend of Gal left the mark on the back of the mirror. There was the bloody tissues. They found there was animal remains on the lawn as well, and then she's getting really cozy with the girlfriend at home and the son while the guys are away on the job. But yeah, I'm still failing how to make the connections in my brain, and it annoys the hell out of me.
But we see, so we're going to talk about it from a folk horror kind of perspective, apart from obviously the obvious folk horror things about masks, cultists, etc. But we see themes of isolation, but not so much isolation as you would see in The Wicker Man, where it is rural isolation.
Yeah.
It is literally like you are surrounded by people, but you still feel isolated. Jay has experienced something in Kiev that we never find out about because he doesn't talk about it, but it's obviously traumatized him, and he cannot communicate or connect with his family. So it leads to that kind of isolation within him. And then we also see the wife. She's Swedish. She's away from her family. She's dealing with poverty and being so in debt and not having her husband, basically. And she's also very isolated. So we do have this theme of complete isolation.
Yeah, very societal isolation.
Yeah.
Even they don't really engage with anyone else. Their world just seems to be them and Gal. So even when they're outside, like conducting surveillance, engaging in the kills, aside from the woman on the check-in desk in the hotel, they don't actually engage with anybody else. There's literally nothing. And I know that, they might be kind of against that, given that they're on a hunt, they're on the kill, but at the same time, you don't see any of their connections to family aside from the wife calling back home. You don't see any indication that there's friends or anyone else involved in their life. They are so cut off.
Yeah, and especially because we see that Jay and his family are in terrific amounts of debt. That is, one of the main problems with his wife is that they don't have a lot of money, but he's very kind of not with it. He spends a lot of money on alcohol and not food or essentials.
Toilet paper.
Yeah. So we have the disintegrating family unit. They're very violent and aggressive towards each other.
Yes.
Super. And like, my heart just went out to the poor son. Like,
it was deeply uncomfortable to watch. And even just seeing the dynamics between the two male characters and their female partners, like the contrast between how Gal engages with his girlfriend, but then also when Jay and his wife are off having an absolute screaming match, that Gal steps up and like stands in to reassure the child, put him to bed, which makes him somewhat likable. And then even as the brief asides, when he and Jay are talking together, he doesn't sound like a great human being anyway in their brief asides. So he seems to know how to play the character a bit better and seems a bit more socially adept than Jay. But it's all really, really deeply uncomfortable interpersonal relationships.
Yes. I think with Gal, because he's a Northern Irish character, he's been brought up in a world of conflict. And I think that's how he has a better hold of things rather than Jay, who has chosen to go into this kind of conflict area of work, which is being a soldier, being a contract killer, whereas Gal has been brought up at this. He's from Northern Ireland. We see him snap at his girlfriend when she tries to just put down the troubles in Northern Ireland to just two Christians fighting over the same thing, and he snaps, and that's when you almost see the real side of Gal.
And even for then the Swedish girlfriend as well mentions about having done military service, which I feel sort of kind of comes off as a bit of a threat to Jay in his role and his previous service and his masculinity in that, and then what he's doing as the contract killer as well. So she's clearly had experience herself. It almost makes her an equal, but then there's like such an unequal footing in the relationship.
Yeah. My heart really did go out to the wife and the child, which I think also leads to the confusion of the ending as well.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah.
I still have no idea. And like the new girlfriend of Gal's was there with the group during the I suppose the parade, the march, or the ritual. But yeah, I'm completely lost. I'm so lost.
Yeah. I mean, we see at the end during this ritual, we see obviously Gal's girlfriend Fiona, and then we also see Jay's doctor that he has gone to because his hands become infected.
Yeah, who was incredibly dismissive of him as well.
Yeah.
And it almost seems like he's really complicit in the entire thing. Because I mean, like, it's a visible infection. It's not just something that can't be demonstrated in a physical respect.
Yeah.
So that was just so bizarre. It's almost incredibly paranoid that the world around him proves to actually be complicit against him.
Yeah.
And that it's far more reaching than we actually anticipated.
Yeah. And I think that's a really big theme within this film, because obviously we've got Jay and his family who, although perhaps not poverty stricken, they are in debt. They don't have a lot of money. He has to do things for money that normal people wouldn't be able to do. But then we've also got these rich people. We've got the MP, we've got the employer who takes out the contract. They're very rich. And we see almost as if all of these people around Jay, like you said, are there to set him up from the beginning. And we can kind of see that with rich versus poor, that the world isn't built for poor people. It is the rich people that set poor people up from the very beginning, you know.
Yep. And even that Jay and his wife are coming in almost like the nouveau riche.
Yeah.
So they're coming in, they've got money, they've put it into the house, they have a very nice house, they have a very good standard of living. It seems like the child has a lot of toys, they've got the jacuzzi at the back and the repeated issues with the jacuzzi and like the talk of the holiday fund and all this. They've had a very comfortable life to a degree, but as you said, there's massive financial worries upon both of them that's causing a huge amount of stress in the relationship. They're trying to keep up with this lifestyle and not managing to do this.
Yeah. So another thing with folklore, British kind of folk horror is the theme of folklore. We obviously, it's very out there in stuff like The Wicker Man. It's very, very out there in your face. Kill List has a degree of folklore in it. They mention King Arthur quite a few times. The child likes to be told stories about King Arthur. And we can kind of see it with Gal and Jay that they are sent on quests and they're kind of eschewed Arthurian heroes completing tasks. And I kind of liked that it was like a nod to, British folklore, as it were.
Yeah.
What did you think of that kind of folkloric theme?
I hadn't picked up on that, but it is I suppose reminding me that the whole thing about when Jay comes back with the shopping, he's bought all the wine, didn't get the toilet paper, completely disregarded the list on the fridge, and he has the toy foam swords.
Yeah.
And there's this brief reprieve in the relationship that while there's still the friction, there's a bit of bickering, they all go out and have a family fight in the back garden.
Yeah.
And there is a bit of foreshadowing in that the son is like holding onto the mother's back and like up on her back while they're having a sword fight and all this fun out in the back garden, which I suppose makes it that bit more jarring that's essentially how it ends as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a smart film. I rewatched it obviously for this podcast and I still love it. Like I still found little bits and pieces and I just think it's such a smart film, and it is, I think if this is the future of British folk horror, I think it's a good one. It's not so in your face. As I've said, The Wicker Man is about its themes. It's very, second watchable. You really have to go back and see it again.
Yeah, I think it's definitely going to be like an onion, like an ogre. It's going to have layers. The more you watch it, the more you realize that there's more pieces at play, and there's other little bits that you completely missed before.
And even, with religion, again, religion's another theme in folk horror. And we see that here, several times Christianity is frowned upon. One of my favorite scenes in this film is when they're in the pub eating and there's the Christian group.
Oh, yeah.
And they're about to sing a song on the guitar, and Jay just loses it and goes up to him and threatens that, if he starts playing that guitar, he'll shove it where the sun don't shine. And
and out of the entire setting of the place as well, it's so weird because they are proper intruders in the environment for them, because out of a very large empty restaurant space, they're essentially the next table over. So it adds to the discomfort and the fact that obviously they're physically uncomfortable because they're jammed right beside these people, but just it's palpable.
Yeah. And I just loved Gal's handling of it as well. He's so he seems quite jovial, but then he's very cutting. And I feel that again, it's his upbringing in Northern Ireland when it came to the Troubles. And it's just...
He's quick on his feet.
Yeah, but he's quite sharp and cutting, and he's almost scarier than Jay. Sometimes it's the quiet horror, the unseen horror that is, and I'm kind of sad that Gal got killed off, because I feel that there was so much more to his character that we could have seen in that perspective.
Yep. And even just from, would Gal have perhaps been complicit if he ended up engaging and finding the ritual group as well? Or would he have been a proper, I suppose, stabilizing influence on Jay, and that it would have been the two of them then stuck in this situation?
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting kind of perspective, and it's almost as if, if he hadn't have died, then we wouldn't have gotten the ending that we did.
No. I did find it rather unique as well in that, I suppose, on the whole folk horror front, that it is usually these remote, isolated places. This all seems relatively commutable. It's mainland UK. For me, and I mentioned at the start that I found that the two movies were very kind of polar opposites in how they approached folk horror, in the fact that it wasn't that the outsiders then went into this situation and bad things then happened. While that's true, it's more the situation found them.
Yeah.
It's that level of paranoia. It seems to be that they are being watched. It's that the employer knew about them and has brought them into this situation and created this environment for them. So finding that the folk horror actually comes to get them rather than them ending up in it was kind of an unusual twist for me, if that makes sense.
No, definitely. We see in the Wicker Man that Constable Edward Woodward, he comes to the island of his free will. And they give him several opportunities to get the fuck out of Dodge, but he stays there and he stays virginal of his free will, whereas Jay has zero free will in all of this.
He's forced entirely into the situation.
And he has no autonomy when it comes to what he does, whether it's he gets threatened or his family get threatened, or even from the very beginning where Gal is trying to persuade him, he has to do it because of money. Money is this god in this film. It is not, the pagan gods that bring good apples or the Christian god. It is the new capitalistic
It's a new religion.
God. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I just think it's such a smart movie. And I'm so in awe of the writers and Ben Wheatley for doing this smart as fuck horror that brings folk horror into the modern era.
Very much so. It definitely modernizes it and still manages to stay very folk horror at the same time. Albeit I was surprised that it took so long to get to that component and to find what the reveal was.
Yes. Yeah, that's one thing. It is very much a slow burner, but my God, the payoff. It is worth it.
Also, it's a really, really engaging movie from a very, because we watch horror for the emotive engagement and the emotive payoff, and this definitely achieved that from beginning to end. It's it's very emotionally captivating because it's so deeply uncomfortable seeing the relationships, seeing the tensions between all the characters, the unhappiness, the frustration, the solitude and isolation. It's all really, really gripping. And then just the reveal of like, what the fuck just happened. And
I know I keep going back and forth to The Wicker Man, but because that is the standard of British,
it is the benchmark.
It is like that point where they go over the hill in The Wicker Man, and there is that giant Wicker Man, and Edward Woodward is like, oh God, oh Lord. It is exactly like that. That is what that reveal is. It is that moment, and I think it should be a classic when it comes to British folk horror.
Cool.
For our times. So looking back on Doomwatch and Kill List, if you had to what's the word?
Rewatch, regurgitate. Animal, vegetable, mineral. Come on, we can do this. Charades. You're fine.
This is where my brain fog just completely fucks me over.
Totally fine.
When you say to someone you should watch this film, so which out of the two films, which one would you what's the word?
Which would I recommend?
There we go.
There you go. And our word of the day is recommend, and our letter of the day is T for telephone.
Every time I have to ask someone this, I always forget that word. I should have a post-it note on my laptop saying recommend. Because
or
I
a tattoo on your wrist. Recommend ?
I always forget this word. Oh my God, this lockdown brain fog killing me. Because I barely have to like talk to other people other than a 3-year-old.
There you go. You have to have daily conversations asking, would you recommend this then?
Yes, and teach my 3-year-old what recommend means.
Yeah.
Anyway,
for your breakfast, would you recommend it to someone else? This episode of Sesame Street, would you recommend it? I don't know. Like, I think there's a lot to be said for both of them. I'm really intrigued to check out the TV show to accompany Doomwatch and kind of see how that translates, because obviously, I mean, we're like, my brain was doing quick math, and it still failed. We are nearly half a century after like the movie's been made.
Oh shit, yeah.
Yes, and I know, weird, right? But like, we're about that point because it was what 1972. So we're 49 years after the movie's been made, and it still holds its own from an environmental perspective. And I think that that's like incredibly pertinent and really interesting. And it's super 70s. Yeah. But it manages to not be dated.
It's quite endearing.
Yeah, like it's there's still something to be taken from it, and I mean it's still relevant. Yeah. So I think that's really, really good, and I think there's a lot to be said about that. But as a horror movie, I would not recommend it as a horror movie because I don't think it's scary. Yeah. No. Maybe a thriller, because there's like this mystery to kind of be unraveled, and there's a bit of danger associated with it, and obviously there's a health impact, and it's more of a detective-y thriller, medical kind of focus.
It's definitely like a Sunday afternoon kind of film.
I can watch it with the lights on and I'm not worried.
Yeah. I could probably watch it with my kid when he's a little bit older. He might have a few questions about things, but it's very, I mean, I think the only shocking moment is when he finds the body.
Yeah.
And that's,
even, yeah. And even then that's not that much.
Yeah.
I forgot to mention earlier, he finds a body in the woods and then the body goes missing. But like, definitely, I think Kill List was unexpected. I, even from watching the trailers for it and stuff, I wasn't sure how the folk horror thing was going to work out. And very much it does like kick in and say like the last 10-15 minutes. But it was really engaging. And there's just this ominous sense of dread throughout the entire thing.
Yeah.
And the level of gore as well. It does tick the boxes as a horror movie for me. Yeah. And I think in recommending it, it would definitely come with the accompanying disclosure of be prepared to face the end of the movie going, what the fuck?
Yeah. I mean, I hate saying smart horror, because all horror is a mirror to society, basically, as even, your silliest of slashers still has somewhat of a social commentary. So I don't really like saying smart horror, but it definitely is more of an intellectual kind of horror. It wouldn't be the kind of thing that you'd put on with your mates to have like a laugh.
Yeah, you're gonna miss too much, and
Yeah.
you're still gonna have the same sense of confusion at the end, to be honest. But
Yeah.
definitely, you kind of need to see everything and pay attention to it, and you're gonna be on the edge of your seat watching it, just wondering what the fuck.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, I definitely think, as I've said, for kind of a look into what the future of British folk horror has, I definitely recommend Kill List, and all of Ben Wheatley's films actually are just, they're spot on. So before I let you go, I would like to ask, what is your favorite horror film?
good question. Not really something that I've overly thought about, to be honest, though. I'm so glad that you kind of forewarned me before this, so I wasn't just going, haha, bollocks, now I have to answer this question. I think, to be honest, it would probably be Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Again, it's not like an overly scary movie. It's one of those beautiful classics, and even connecting it, not that it's COVID pertinent, but I got to go to a centenary screening of it last year with one of my friends as one of the last like social things that I did in town before having to retreat from the plague and hide in my own home. And it's such a beautiful, striking, weird movie. And I'm just so in love with the really
expressionistic.
It's a kind of pre-cubism. It's just really, really harsh imagery. Even just like the makeup and the effects is just stunning. I'm in love with that style. So there's a few other movies from the time that I've found, like there's a really fantastic like early version of Frankenstein and Fall of the House of Usher, and then there's Genuine, which is a vampire movie. It's a very strange name, but there's a few others from the time that mimic the style quite nicely. They're much, much shorter by comparison, but just I'm absolutely in love with it.
I have quite a soft spot for Cabinet of Dr. Caligari because I have a diploma in visual communication, and we have to do like a little thesis for the end of our year, and I did mine on German expressionism in horror films.
Perfect.
And their posters, because obviously it has to go back to graphic design. So I studied a lot of the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. That was like my spine of my thesis. As well as Nosferatu. So I have a soft spot for that because I had to go into the history of, the time of Germany when it was made. And obviously, it was kind of around the Weimar period. And so I think anyone who is into horror should go and watch it and then learn about the era that it came from. It's fantastic visually, absolutely fantastic.
It's definitely, I suppose, a bucket list almost kind of writes it off. Like it's definitely one of those movies that you just have to watch. Much like Metropolis, it's one of those old amazing classics that you're just going to be blown away by what was achieved so early on in the life of modern cinema. And it's just this stunning, beautiful creation, and I'm so glad that it's one of the surviving ones as well, because I mean, like so many of Lon Chaney's work has been just lost. Like London After Midnight been one of the big ones.
Okay, so thank you very much for coming on and discussing.
Thank you for having me.
British folk horror with me. I hope it wasn't all bleakness.
No, also I will say as well, just as anyone who's watched Spaced will probably get a giggle out of this, because starting into watching Kill List, I realized that Gal is Tyres from Spaced, so I kind of couldn't really totally get that out of my head. So he's the really harsh northerner bike courier. So that was kind of a little bit of light relief for myself.
And God knows you need it when you're watching folk horror.
Oh, totally.
So thank you very much.
So that was my chat there with Lydia Addams about British folk horror, and in particular 2 films: the ecological folk horror Doomwatch, directed by Peter Sadsy, which, it was kind of it was before The Wicker Man, and as we said, you can see a lot of similarities in it, but it is a lot more of a positive and happy ending than the rather bleak Wicker Man ending. Obviously, it doesn't end in human sacrifice. And then we have Ben Wheatley's Kill List from 2011. So Thank you very much to my guest, Lydia Addams, and thank you very much for listening and continuously listening to this podcast. I hope you are enjoying it as much as I am enjoying doing it. And if you would be so kind as to subscribe, comment, and review on whatever podcast platform you are listening to us on, that really helps with us gaining new listeners. So as ever, if you would like to put your 2 cents in about British folk horror, are you a fan? Do you think there are better films out there that kind of encompass British folk horror, whether back from the 70s or modern day British folk horror? Let us know on our social media on Instagram and Facebook at What a Scream Podcast, or you can email us at Gmail, or even just over email, sorry, whatascreampodcast@gmail.com. And also, if you think you would make the perfect guest for What a Scream, I am always looking for new guests. It doesn't matter what field you are in. If you are just a big horror nerd, I want to hear from you. So again, just email me or private message me over our social media. So as ever, I hope you are staying safe and you are taking care of yourself and yours. And as ever, stay horrific. Goodbye.
Shouldn't be afraid of bees. Shouldn't be afraid of those creepy crawlies. You should be afraid of me. Shouldn't be scared of the Dracula. Shouldn't be scared of the mummy. Shouldn't be scared of Frankenstein's monster.